want to know that there will be a footnoted, annotated version of this sermon posted online in a few days, which will save me the effort of having to reference everything as I say goodbye to you today after service. Because I'm going to lay some facts on you this morning. For instance, it is a fact that in this great nation, the land of opportunity, and what is regarded as the richest nation in the world, that 1 out of every 3 children live in poverty. So much thanks to Yoto. 1 out of every 3 kids lives in poverty in a country that is of and by the people. 1 in 3 children live in poverty in a country wherein we elect those who make the policies that allow for that travesty to perpetuate. Maybe that state of affairs is the case because it is also a fact that our middle class is eroding and has been for 4 decades. The middle class is the ballast of democracy. The middle class has formed the connective tissue of meritocracy by where one is provided the means and opportunity to pull oneself up by the bootstraps. The wealthy and the poor now combine to outnumber the middle. The middle class is a minority. More alarming yet, it is a fact that while the number of people in the middle class has indeed shrunk, that is nothing when compared to the decimation of their share of the wealth in this country. For instance, in the 1960s, the top 1% of wage earners collected a little more than 5% of all wage incomes. So 1960s, 1% accounts for 5%. The top 1% accounts for 5% of the wealth. However, today the top 1% owns about 35% of the wealth. 1%, 35% of the wealth. The next 35% is owned by the top 10%. So, all told, the top 10% accounts for 70% of the wealth in this country. The next 40%, and that's the middle class, owns about a quarter of the total. And much of that is in the form of housing. The remaining half of the population owns next to nothing. About 5% of the total wealth. Half the population of America owns 5% of the total wealth. In 5 decades, wealth has been redistributed to the top 1% to the tune of a 30% increase. Partially this is true because doing nothing is doing something. This is true for economics as it is for anything else. And you see, it is a fact that wealth currently earns more by doing nothing than labor earns by working. So even without seeking to warp the system to their own increase, the playing field already privileges wealth over merit, innovation, and labor. That's not necessarily nefarious. That's just the way the system has been constructed. Not to say that we can't correct it. But it is this way because there are rules or lack of rules around what returns wealth may or may not yield. And for instance, capital is taxed less than labor, may be passed down with negligible taxation regardless of the amount being passed down, thus encouraging the creation of an inheriting aristocracy right here in the USA. It is a fact that this top 1% are more politically active than the other 99%. They fund the candidates and also pay for policies to be written and given to those candidates. And while it may not be a fact, it is statistically evident that the top 1% of our country in control of 35% of the wealth in this country have as their chief concern not the good of the people or the country, but rather the good of themselves. With their abundance of influence and attention, they primarily focus on their own economic interests, directing their political activity towards issues reflecting the factors they perceive as affecting wealth creation, not the general welfare of most Americans. This, by the way, is according to them. I'm not throwing stones. I'm listening to what they say they are interested in. Some smart people from Chicago, University of Chicago and Northwestern, asked them. These are not my opinions. They're the professional observations of social scientists collecting actual data. And they are the findings that led those social scientists at the University of Chicago and Northwestern who conducted the study that revealed this evidence to conclude that such a political economic system, meaning our political economic system, is best described by the term soft fascism. The top 1% wield an offensively inordinate and dangerous amount of power, whose primary intention, according to their own testimony, is their own preservation and increase. So we live in a fascist country. And not only do they not care about you, they don't care about what you say you care about. Whether or not you actually care about that is an open question, and we'll get to that in a minute. But check this out. Of the top 1%, according to the top 1%, only 40% support a living minimum wage, compared with 78% of the general public. Only 23% agree that the government should provide a decent standard of living for the unemployed, compared to 50% of the general public. Only 19% of the top agree that the government in Washington ought to see that everyone who wants to work can find a job, whereas 68% of the general public finds that that is important. The top 1% are not in line with the thinking of the general population. By the way, some of you may be resisting this a little bit, but you're not in the top 1%. Nobody here is in the top 1%. And if you are, we need a bigger building. The top 1% don't think like most Americans think. That includes 99%. So not all 99% of Americans are idiots, right? Can we agree on that? So they also have a strong bias against public schools, with only 35% agreeing that the federal government should spend whatever is necessary to ensure that all children have really good public schools they can go to. 35% of the top 1% thinks that that's a good thing, while 87% of the general public thinks that's a good idea. Meanwhile, who are these 13%? Meanwhile, the same study found that the top 1% consider climate change a non-issue, and most would cut federal and state safety nets and anti-poverty programs, shift taxpayer dollars into privatized education, and do little to ensure access to higher education. We're talking about the political preferences of the most politically active demographic who holds a third of the wealth in this country. Now that leads to situations where in some states in this great country where we have justice from sea to shining sea, that if you secretly tape abuses, actual actual abuses of the elderly or of animals, and then share that recording with the media or an advocacy group instead of your boss, you can be sued by business owners for bad publicity and required to pay a fine of $5,000 for each day that that person is gathering information without authorization. So whistleblowing is illegal. That's North Carolina, by the way, our cousin in Koch Industries. Welcome to America. Fascism, it's more comfortable than you thought, right? Well, it is until it isn't, my friends. So how did this happen? Why is this so, and how do we not know this? How are we allowing this to occur? Because evidently, we've got a problem. It looks like a justice problem, and it looks like a justice problem dressed up in the costume of an economic problem. It looks like a two-class society, well, or 2.5 class society, the poor, the wealthy, and the ruling class of super wealthy. It looks like a widening gap in capital, influence, and power that threatens to undermine our democracy, pit poor against poor, institutionalize an American aristocracy, and destroy the human habitability of our planet. It looks like levers being pulled by the top 10th of 1%, a demographic blinded by their proximity to the sun, blind to all but their own interest, their own momentum, their own sensual gratification, their own insatiable greed. It looks like oligarchic fascism. Amen. So we've got a problem. But while it looks like a justice problem, it ain't that. What we have is an identity problem. Identity. I know that takes the measurable and makes it abstract, and that makes it harder to hold and see and understand, but when you are pulling weeds, if you just yank out the stem, the thing grows back. You've got to get underneath, and if you don't get underneath the studies and stats, we might fool ourselves into thinking that this problem is somebody else's fault and somebody else's consequence. So let's look at this problem that has our country stupefied by fascism. We have to talk about the real problem, identity. That is who we are. That is us. For those of you who read the Facebook, you know that writing this sermon made me hanker for a scotch and a punching bag. Now you know why. I didn't get either one, by the way. So let's talk about identity. Let's talk about who we are. Identity is somewhat inherent and somewhat created. It is created when what is inherent in our biological psychology comes up against what seems inherent socially. That's the origin of identity. But after origination, identity must be actively maintained. It is maintained through stories. It is maintained by frameworks that we either accept or personally and cooperatively put effort into maintaining. So now we're talking about meaning. We're talking about how we come to understand ourselves and the world. Identity is a function of meaning making and maintenance. I'm doing the background work here, which I feel is important. And the making and maintenance of meaning is a religious endeavor. And so when I say we have an identity problem, I mean we have a religious problem. And lucky for you, you find yourself this morning in a religious house with religious people. So you are in a good position to work on this problem. My definition of religion, by the way, is relevant to this reflection. My definition of religion is broad and goes far beyond the self-identified institutions of religion. I say humans are religious like we breathe. We can't help it. It's how we are alive. Religiosity as meaning-making and maintenance arises with consciousness and self-awareness and is either intentional or unintentional, but definitely inescapable. We are religious animals. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, our institutional freedom, coupled with the breadth and automaticity of natural religiosity, creates an open space that compels us, you use, to select, test, review, and refine religion, to bring self-conscious intentionality to automatic processes. Does that sound at all familiar?
Hallelujah.
I've been preaching on that for 2 years now. It turns out that what makes for wise humans also makes for good religion. So we have an identity problem that looks like an economic problem, creating justice problems, but is really here in this space with its orientation and resources, a religious problem. And all that is to say at last this. The problem is that you're not the problem. And to fight back the forces of fascism, folks, you really need to be the problem. You need to be a problem. But you need to be a problem not only to the 1%. You need to examine yourself. You need to be a problem to yourself. To examine your identity. We need to examine our identity. We need to decide who we want to be and to ask whether or not that is, in fact, who we are. Are we walking our talk? And through that self-examination, through that discovery of your problem, of you as a beautiful problem, through working to remedy and solve the problem of you, of who you are, you have the opportunity to become a problem to those who would solve you and others by undermining, underfunding, underpaying, undereducating, ignoring, suing, or jailing you. Yes, you. You see, the problem with our identity is twofold. One, it is too often self-centered or short-sighted. It's a natural mistake. What I mean is that in an interconnected reality, the definition of an I or a you is meaningless without a we. What I mean is that what happens to the least of us happens to you. What I mean is that until we see ourselves as both oppressor and oppressed, we will neither be guilt-ridden enough nor irate enough to realize that we do not, or that we do indeed have skin in the game and a stake in the trajectory of history. What I mean is that we are Unitarian Universalists and we are Americans, and by God, that has to mean something to you. Deeply, personally and viscerally, for your heart to awaken to the danger that you are in. For it is not somebody else who is in danger here. It is you. The identity problem. It is not someone else's fault. It is yours. And it is not someone else's responsibility to bring justice to this world. As long as there is injustice anywhere, there is injustice everywhere. Or maybe that's just sentiment. It soothes by its righteousness and requires of us no integrity. Because there is here and now an insidious creeping oppression and injustice of which we are both perpetrator and victim. And that has got to be woken up to and stopped. The second fold, I guess, of our twofold identity problem is that we often find ourselves rooting for our values rather than practicing them. Like our values were football teams that we support by screaming their names in the stands. But that is not how values work. That is a fractured identity because it says one thing but does another. And remember, there's no such thing as doing nothing, right? Doing nothing is doing something. So what are you going to do? The question you may be asking now is, okay, preacher, where do I start? Well, even though I can tell you that there is a justice coordinating or a justice committee of the whole meeting happening after church today, and there is a UU day at the legislature coming up in a couple weeks, and a justice workshop on race and class coming up on the 27th at Chandler UU, and a series of adult education classes happening here about to begin on economic inequality. If you ask me, where do I start, preacher, I'm going to tell you that that is a good question for you to answer. Be a problem to yourself. Work on solving that problem. Anyway, here's the real question. In a land where 1 in 3 kids lives in poverty, while 1% of the population holds 35% of the wealth and wields ever more power, who are you? Who are you? And what does it mean to be who you say you are?